The Unexpurgated Pike Report. Forward by Philip Agee. Report of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, 1976. Publisher's note. The Pike Committee report includes extensive footnotes. The footnotes are too substantial to be both included here and maintain the listenable narrative. Thus, the footnotes were excluded from this audiobook version. Interested listeners can find them in the original PDF version of the report available on archive.org. Section 2. The Select Committee's Investigative Record. C. Risks. The American taxpayer clearly does not receive full value for his intelligence dollar. The costs of intelligence should not, however, be measured in dollars alone. Many day-to-day activities inevitably pose real risks. The committee has found that when results are measured against hazards alone, certain intelligence programs may be wholly unacceptable. Other projects may too easily stray from wise and worthwhile courses without detection. It is disturbing that the consequences of intelligence activities are sometimes apparently given scant consideration by policymakers. Even more troubling are indications that this insensitivity continues when dangers reveal themselves. 1. Covert action. The committee has examined CIA covert action operations and has considerable evidence that they are irregularly approved, sloppily implemented, and at times have been forced on a reluctant CIA by the President and his National Security Advisor. Covert action may be defined as clandestine activity other than purely information gathering, which is directed at producing a particular political, economic, or military result. Successive administrations have cited Section 102 of the National Security Act of 1947 as the legal justification for covert action. During the course of this investigation, the special counsel to the Director of Central Intelligence has argued that the President, in his conduct of foreign relations, has an inherent constitutional mandate to authorize these activities. On the other hand, in recent years, commentators have maintained that in establishing the CIA, Congress had no specific intention that covert operations apart from intelligence gathering missions be conducted. Witnesses before the committee likewise disputed any inherent constitutional power to conduct covert actions. In any event, Congress has implicitly acquiesced in covert action through the oversight process. It may be argued that there has been explicit approval as well. Just as the War Powers Act acknowledges the authority of the President to conduct overt military hostilities, albeit for a limited period, without a congressional declaration of war, the Ryan-Hughes Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1974 formally acknowledges the existence and legality of covert action. The committee has surveyed all 40 committee approvals since 1965 and has delved deeply into 3 recent covert action projects. It is believed that the committee's review of 10 years of covert action is without precedent in the Congress or the executive branch. A. 10-year survey. Our primary purpose was to determine whether the 40 Committee and its predecessors had been exercising their oversight and control responsibilities from 1965 to date. To do this, it was necessary to trace the process from proposal to final approval. Like other aspects of covert action, fixing responsibility for the initiation of various covert action projects was a difficult task. As recorded in 40 committee records, the vast majority of projects was submitted by the CIA, 88% of the total projects since 1965. The high number of covert action proposals represents a general activism within the foreign affairs bureaucracy, especially within CIA. The overall picture, however, does not support the contention that covert action has been used in furtherance of any particular principle, form of government, or identifiable national interest. Instead, the record indicates a general lack of long-term direction in U.S. foreign policy. Covert actions, as the means for implementing a policy, reflected this Band-Aid approach, substituting short-term remedies for problems which required long-term cures. Covert action proposals came from a variety of interest areas: a foreign head of state, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, an ambassador, CIA, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, a cabinet member, or the President himself. Proposals involving a large expenditure of funds or classified as politically sensitive required review and approval of the 40 Committee. Unfortunately, the executive branch does not have a clear definition of what constitutes a large or politically sensitive operation. Projects of less sensitivity are approved within the CIA, usually at the level of Deputy Director of Operations, with the determination of political sensitivity being left to the Director of Central Intelligence. The 40 Committee is chaired by the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and includes the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Director of Central Intelligence. Theoretically, a detailed proposal is presented to this group. The members are then afforded an opportunity for a full discussion of the merits and a reporting of their views to the President. In practice, the 40 Committee has been little more than a rubber stamp. The procedures for approval of covert action have changed with administrations, political conditions, and personalities. At various times, the approval process has been relatively informal, extraordinarily secretive, and pro forma. While on occasion some projects have been considered in depth, at committee meetings which included the approval or disapproval by formal votes, several informal procedures have been frequently used. These informal procedures, such as telephonic votes, do not allow each member to benefit from the views of his colleagues. At times, members have been given only the barest of details, and instead of formal votes, have simply been allowed the opportunity to acknowledge the project's existence. The 40 Committee has only one full-time professional staff member. Because of the high degree of compartmentation attending these projects, committee members, who are among the busiest officials in government, are frequently in the position of evaluating a complex proposal without adequate staff support. The Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and the Director of Central Intelligence, having the incentive and the resources to cope with 40 Committee business, clearly dominate the process. The origin of many covert action projects is murky at best. The CIA, as the prospective implementation arm, is often directed to produce proposals for covert action and is therefore incorrectly seen as a plan's original proponent. It is clear that on several occasions involving highly sensitive projects, CIA was summarily ordered by the President or his national security advisor to carry out a covert action program. It is further clear that CIA has been ordered to engage in covert action over the agency's strong prior objections. All evidence in hand suggests that the CIA, far from being out of control, has been utterly responsive to the instructions of the President and the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. It must be remembered, however, that the CIA Director determines which CIA-initiated covert action projects are sufficiently politically sensitive to require presidential attention. From 1965 to 1972, a majority of approvals occurred subsequent to a formal committee meeting, although many telephonic approvals also took place during this period. In 1972, the process became quite informal, often involving mere notification to members that an operation had already been set in motion by the President. The 40 Committee, as the review and approval mechanism for covert action, fell into virtual disuse, with telephonic approvals being the rule and formal meetings the exception. One formal meeting was held in 1972, none in 1973 and 1974. This process did not begin to reverse itself until 1975. B. Election support. From 1965 to date, 32% of 40 committee-approved covert action projects were for providing some form of financial election support to foreign parties and individuals. Such support could be negative as well as positive. This is the largest covert action category, and its funding has occurred in large part in the developing countries. With few exceptions, financial support has been given to incumbent moderate party leaders and heads of state. Certain projects have had a long life. One third world leader received some $960,000 over a 14-year period. Others were financially supported for over a decade. C. Media and propaganda. Some 29% of 40 committee-approved covert actions were for media and propaganda projects. This number is probably not representative. Staff has determined the existence of a large number of CIA internally approved operations of this type, apparently deemed not politically sensitive. It is believed that if the correct number of all media and propaganda projects could be determined, it would exceed election support as the largest single category of covert action projects undertaken by the CIA. Activities have included support of friendly media, major propaganda efforts, insertion of articles into the local press, and distribution of books and leaflets. By far, the largest single recipient has been a European publishing house funded since 1951. There are a number of similar operations in the region. About 25% of the program has been directed at the Soviet bloc in the publication and clandestine import and export of Western and Soviet dissident literature. D. Paramilitary arms transfers. The 23% approvals in this category from 1965 to 1975 have taken one of essentially four forms: secret armies, financial support to groups engaged in hostilities, paramilitary training and advisors, and shipment of arms, ammunition, and other military equipment. Military ordnance is typically supplied by CIA out of its large inventory of U.S. weaponry and captured foreign weapons. The committee scrutinized these projects carefully, since this category is the most expensive and represents the greatest potential for escalating hostilities and deepening American involvement. By far the most interesting and important fact to emerge was the recognition that the great majority of these covert action projects were proposed by parties outside CIA. Many of these programs were summarily ordered over CIA objections. CIA misgivings, however, were at times weakly expressed, as CIA is afflicted with a can-do attitude. At times, CIA has been used as a conduit for arms transfers in order to bypass congressional scrutiny. A State Department proposed project which could have been accomplished under the Military Assistance Program was tasked on CIA because the Department of Defense did not desire to return to Congress for additional funds and approval. E. Organizational support. A plethora of foreign, civic, religious, professional, and labor organizations have received CIA funding. There has been no real geographical concentration, although the Third World was again well represented. For example, one labor confederation in a developing country received an annual subsidy of $30,000 in 3 successive years. F. Trends. Since 1965, there has been a general decline in the number of covert action projects approved by the 40 Committee. There are indications that the low figure represents the Director of Central Intelligence's determination that not as many projects should be considered politically sensitive and taken to the 40 Committee for approval. This, in turn, may reflect his recognition that the 40 Committee had fallen into disuse and their approvals pro forma. There is no indication that the passage of the Ryan Hughes Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1974, requiring presidential certification and briefings of congressional oversight committees, has had a significant impact on the National Covert Action Program. As the events of 1975 have shown, those who had warned that the amendment and the congressional probes into the U.S. intelligence community would make covert action impossible have not seen their fears realized. G. 3 projects. The 3 projects examined in depth were selected from major recent operations apart from the American experience in Indochina and involved different types of covert activity. One was election funding of pro-U.S. elements in an allied country. The second was presidentially directed arms support of an insurgency movement at the behest of the foreign head of a third country. The last involved a mix of political action, military training, and assistance to pro-Western forces in Angola. The last project was also initiated in part at the request of a third party. The committee became aware of each of these operations through other parts of its investigation and through information provided to staff by sources outside the intelligence community. For example, a study of CIA arms inventories and shipments led to the major agency paramilitary support operations. The case studies are not representative of all covert action since 1965. The committee does believe that they are not atypical of most major programs of this type. CIA has indicated its agreement with the completeness and factual accuracy of the staff's analysis, though not necessarily with the conclusions. Case 1. Election support. The U.S., perhaps needlessly, expended some $10 million in contributions to political parties, affiliated organizations, and 21 individual candidates in a recent parliamentary election held in an allied country. The program was initiated by our ambassador, who later persuaded the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs to authorize him, rather than CIA, to select funding recipients and otherwise control the program's implementation. The results of the aid were mixed and short-lived. With National Assembly elections less than 2 years away, the U.S. country team concluded from a CIA-contracted survey that the pro-U.S. elements, which had governed the country since the post-war period, were being seriously challenged by the communists. The opposition, apparently heavily financed by Moscow, had scored gains in regional elections and trailed the incumbents by only a few points in the opinion polls. Pro-West parties and affiliates had received substantial funding in the past. CIA reports total U.S. election financing over previous 20-year period at some $65 million. Despite this massive aid, the beneficiaries had suffered repeated electoral setbacks. American observers apparently concluded that another quick fix was necessary to see out clients through the next vote. Anxious to gain control of the covert program and fearing that interagency consideration would be inhibiting, the ambassador has originally sought the president's personal approval of this proposed political action. This course would avoid the 40 Committee and, with it, the inevitable role of CIA in implementing the program. The ambassador was rebuffed. Ironically, the assistant to the president then requested that CIA draft a proposal without the knowledge of the ambassador or the Department of State. It is known that during this period, the president was indirectly approached by prominent international businessmen who were former nationals of the allied country. Their communications to the president were not available to the committee. The 40 Committee subsequently approved the CIA proposal, but with unusual implementation. Despite the usual near-automatic control of covert action by CIA, the ambassador, by all accounts a man of unusual force, successfully extracted from the assistant to the president the commitment that he would have total control of the mix and implementation of the project. Thus, the ambassador, who had been in the country less than 2 years and did not speak the language, would determine which individuals and organizations would receive U.S. funds. The CIA station would be reduced to couriers. The agency expressed concern that a high profile by the ambassador would needlessly compromise the program. Their complaints fell on deaf ears, despite the agreement of all that exposure would bring down the pro-West government. A major political party received $3.4 million. A political organization created and supported by CIA, $3.4 million. other organizations and parties a total of $1.3 million. Substantial funds were provided to several incumbents whose seats did not appear in jeopardy. Of a total of $11.8 million approved by the 40 Committee, only $9.9 million was actually spent. The reserve was held to be spent in the following year. CIA concurred in most of the recipients chosen by the ambassador, although differences were expressed on precise amounts. There were serious disagreements over some recipients. One of these was a high local intelligence official to whom the ambassador wanted to give over $800,000 to conduct a propaganda effort. The ambassador was unmoved by CIA warnings that the man was clearly linked to anti-democratic elements of the right, and went ahead with the funding. Embassy control of the funds was poor. Participants in the program testified before the committee that little effort was made to earmark grants or, failing that, at least seek assurances that the money was spent as intended by the 40 Committee. The ambassador resisted most CIA control suggestions, insisting that such monitoring would insult the recipient. Thus, there is almost no accounting or control of the expenditures. There is no indication that the ambassador began to encounter interference from Washington at this point. The fruits of this U.S. investment are difficult to assess. The pro-U.S. elements retained control of the government by a small plurality, and most of the incumbents supported were returned to office. On the other hand, the ruling coalition quickly lost public support and suffered severe reverses in subsequent local elections. Case 2. The President's Program. Records of the 40 Committee reveal that President Richard M. Nixon and Henry A. Kissinger, at the behest of a foreign head of state, unilaterally directed the CIA to provide arms and money to an insurgent group in a third country. The president acted despite the fact that both the CIA and the Department of State had rejected similar operations on 3 occasions over the previous 2 years, and despite a prior disapproval by Dr. Kissinger as Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. The program, ultimately to involve some $16 million, was apparently endorsed by the president after a private meeting with the foreign head of state and Dr. Kissinger. There was no 40 Committee meeting at which a formal proposal paper containing both pros and cons could be discussed and voted on. Instead, members were simply directed to acknowledge receipt of a sparse, one-paragraph description of the operation. In a setting of almost unprecedented secrecy within the U.S. government, John B. Connally, the former Treasury Secretary, about to assume a major role in the president's re-election campaign, personally advised the head of state that the U.S. would cooperate. The recipients of U.S. arms and cash were an insurgent ethnic group fighting for autonomy in a country bordering our ally. The bordering country and our ally had long been bitter enemies. They differed substantially in ideological orientation and in their relations with the U.S. Evidences collected by the committee suggest that the project was initially primarily as a favor to our ally, who had cooperated with U.S. intelligence agencies and who had come to feel menaced by his neighbor. As our allies' aid dwarfed the U.S. aid package, our assistance can be seen as largely symbolic. Documents made available to the committee indicate that the U.S. acted, in effect, as a guarantor that the insurgent group would not be summarily dropped by the foreign head of state. Notwithstanding these implicit assurances, the insurgents were abruptly cut off by our ally, 3 years, thousands of deaths, and $16 million later. It appears that, had the U.S. not reinforced our allies' prodding, the insurgents may have reached an accommodation with the central government, thus gaining at least a measure of autonomy while avoiding further bloodshed. Instead, our clients fought on, sustaining thousands of casualties and 200,000 refugees. There is little doubt that the highly unusual security precautions and the circumvention of the 40 Committee were the product of fears by the President and Dr. Kissinger that details of the project would otherwise leak, a result which by all accounts would have mightily displeased our ally. It is also clear that the secrecy was motivated by a desire that the Department of State, which had consistently opposed such ventures in the region, be kept in the dark. Perhaps more than the President's disregard of the 40 Committee, the apparent no-win policy of the U.S. and its ally deeply disturbed this committee. Documents in the committee's possession clearly show that the President, Dr. Kissinger, and the foreign head of state hoped that our clients would not prevail. They preferred instead that the insurgents simply continue a level of hostilities sufficient to sap the resources of our allies' neighboring country. This policy was not imparted to our clients, who were encouraged to continue fighting. Even in the context of covert action, ours was a cynical enterprise. It is particularly ironic that despite President Nixon's and Dr. Kissinger's encouragement of hostilities to keep the target country off balance, the United States personally restrained the insurgents from an all-out offensive on one occasion when such an attack might have been successful because other events were occupying the neighboring country. All U.S. aid was channeled through our collaborator, without whose logistical help direct assistance would have been impossible. Our national interest had thus become effectively meshed with his. Accordingly, when our ally reached an agreement with the target country and abruptly ended his own aid to the insurgents, the U.S. had no choice but to acquiesce. The extent of our ally's leverage over U.S. policy was such that he apparently made no effort to notify his junior American partners that the program's end was near. The insurgents were clearly taken by surprise as well. Their adversaries, knowing of the impending aid cutoff, launched an all-out search and destroy campaign the day after the agreement was signed. The autonomy movement was over, and our former clients scattered before the central government's superior forces. The cynicism of the U.S. and its ally had not yet completely run its course, however. Despite direct pleas from the insurgent leader and the CIA station chief in the area to the President and Dr. Kissinger, the U.S. refused to extend humanitarian assistance to the thousands of refugees created by the abrupt termination of military aid. As the committee staff was reminded by a high U.S. official, quote, "Covert action should not be confused with missionary work." End quote. Case 3. Angola. For reasons not altogether clear, and despite the opposition of senior government officials, the U.S. has been heavily involved in the current civil war in Angola. The CIA has informed the committee that since January 1975, it had expended over $31 million in military hardware, transportation costs, and cash payments by the end of 1975. The committee has reason to believe that the actual U.S. investment is much higher. Information supplied to the committee also suggests that the military intervention of the Soviet Union and Cuba is in large part a reaction to U.S. efforts to break a political stalemate in favor of its clients. The beneficiaries of U.S. aid are two of the three contesting factions: the National Front for the Independence of Angola, FNLA, and the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA. The third faction contesting for control of the government, following independence on November 11, 1975, is the Soviet-backed Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA. CIA estimates that the fighting had claimed several thousand casualties by the end of 1975. The main U.S. client is the National Front, headed by Holden Roberto, a longtime associate and relative of President Mobutu Sese Seko of neighboring Zaire. Subsequent to President Mobutu's request last winter to Dr. Kissinger, as independence for Angola became a certainty and liberation groups began to jockey for position, the 40 Committee approved furnishing Roberto $300,000 for various political action activities, restricted to non-military objectives. Later events have suggested that this infusion of U.S. aid, unprecedented and massive in the underdeveloped colony, may have panicked the Soviets into arming their MPLA clients, whom they had backed for over a decade and who were now in danger of being eclipsed by the National Front. Events in Angola took a bellicose turn as the U.S. was requested by President Mobutu to make a serious military investment. In early June 1975, CIA prepared a proposal paper for military aid to pro-U.S. elements in Angola, the cost of which was set at $6 million. A revised program, costing $14 million, was approved by the 40 Committee and by President Ford in July. This was increased to $25 million in August and to about $32 million in November. By midsummer, it was decided that U.S. aid should not be given solely to Roberto, but instead divided between him and UNITA's Jonas Savimbi. The committee has learned that a task force composed of high U.S. experts in Africa strongly opposed military intervention. Instead, last April, they called for diplomatic efforts to encourage a political settlement among the three factions to avert bloodshed. Apparently, at the direction of National Security Council aides, the task force recommendation was removed from the report and presented to NSC members as merely one policy option. The other two alternatives were a hands-off policy or substantial military intervention. Of CIA's $31 million figure, said to represent expenditures to the end of 1975, about half is attributed to supply of light arms, mortars, ammunition, vehicles, boats, and communication equipment. The balance includes shipping expenses and cash payments. The committee has reason to question the accuracy of CIA's valuation of military equipment sent to Angola. A staff accountant on loan from the General Accounting Office has determined that CIA costing procedures and the use of surplus equipment have resulted in a substantial understatement of the value of U.S. aid. Examples include 45 caliber automatic weapons valued by CIA at $5,100 each and 30 caliber semi-automatic carbines at $7.55. Based on a sampling of ordnance cost figures and a comparison with Department of Defense procedures, staff advises that the CIA's ordnance figure should at least be doubled. Dr. Kissinger has indicated that U.S. military intervention in Angola is based on three factors: Soviet support of the MPLA and the USSR's increased presence in Africa, U.S. policy to encourage moderate independence groups in southern Africa, and the U.S. interest in promoting the stability of Mobutu and other leadership figures in the area. Past support to Mobutu, along with his responsiveness to some of the United States' recent diplomatic needs for Third World support, make it equally likely that the paramount factor in the U.S. involvement is Dr. Kissinger's desire to reward and protect African leaders in the area. The U.S.'s expressed opposition to the MPLA is puzzling in view of Director Colby's statement to the committee that there are scant ideological differences among the three factions, all of whom are nationalists above all else. Control of resources may be a factor. Angola has significant oil deposits, and two American multinationals, Gulf and Texaco, operate in the offshore area. Gulf had deposited some $100 million in concession fees in a national bank now under MPLA control. At the suggestion of the U.S. government, the company has suspended further payments. Until recently, the U.S.-backed National Front was supported by the People's Republic of China, which had provided about 100 military advisors. Mobutu has provided a staging area for U.S. arms shipments and has periodically sent Zaire's troops, trained by the Republic of North Korea, into Angola to support Roberto's operations. Small numbers of South African forces have been in the country and are known to have been in contact with Savimbi's UNITA forces. Pursuant to Section 662 of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1974, the President has found that the Angola Action Program is, quote, important to the national security, end quote. As directed by the Act, CIA has briefed the Congressional Oversight Committees as to the 40 Committee approvals of increased amounts of military aid. CIA officials have testified to the committee that there appears to be little hope of an outright MPLA military defeat. Instead, U.S. efforts are now aimed at promoting a stalemate and, in turn, the ceasefire and the coalition government urged by the long-forgotten NSC task force. 2. Intelligence collection. Human and diplomatic risks are not confined to covert action. Certain methods of intelligence gathering invite the same danger of war and infringement of the constitutional rights of Americans. The committee has examined both technical and non-technical intelligence gathering programs and has concluded that the risks accompanying them are often unacceptably great, that information obtained often does not justify the risk. The policymakers have been insensitive to dangers, especially of the violation of U.S. citizens' rights, and that there are inadequate policy-level mechanisms for the regular review of risk assessment. A. Submarines. A highly technical U.S. Navy submarine reconnaissance program, often operating within unfriendly waters, has experienced at least 9 collisions with hostile vessels in the last 10 years, over 110 possible detections, and at least 3 press exposures. Most of the submarines carry nuclear weapons. The program clearly produces useful information on our adversaries' training exercises, weapons testing, and general naval capabilities. It is also clear, however, that the program is inherently risky. Committee staff's review of the program suggests if both Congress and the Department of the Navy were sufficiently motivated to provide the funds, technical capabilities could be developed which would make possible the acquisition of the same data through less hazardous means. The Navy's own justification of the program as a low-risk venture is inaccurate and has, therefore, not met or resolved the committee's misgivings. Documents provided the committee by the Defense Department indicate that while risk assessments are made prior to operations, they are ritualistic and pro forma. In fact, their mission risk assessments do not vary despite constant changes in political conditions, information sought, distance from enemy shores and hostile forces, and our adversaries' ability to detect the presence of U.S. submarines. During the hundreds of missions these submarines have conducted, the Navy has never assessed military risk as anything but low. The committee is, therefore, troubled by the completely pro forma nature of the mission risk assessment as it is presently accomplished. Just as the Navy's assurances that the program is secure are inconsistent with the collisions, apparent detections, and press stories, their claims that the sensitive missions are closely monitored are belied by the scant technical guidance given commanders and regular communications gaps. Once a U.S. submarine enters the 12-mile limit of another nation, communications security and the lack of certain technical capabilities make it impossible to independently verify the location of a submarine at any given moment. Many of these difficulties result from factors which are inherent in the nature of this covert operation. Naval inquiries into collisions and other untoward incidents, if held at all, are almost always conducted at a low level, effectively keeping policymakers in the dark on changing operational conditions. Thus, it took a field-initiated, low-level investigation conducted after 3 collisions in 1970 to determine that pre-mission training and operational guidelines for U.S. submarines on this type of sensitive mission needed revision and upgrading. If Washington-based review had been adequate, it would not have taken this field investigation to determine that U.S. submarines were following other submarines too closely. In addition, staff found no evidence which would indicate that commanders of submarines colliding with hostile vessels have ever received disciplinary action of any kind. At times, commanders have escaped censure despite recommendations to that effect by a review panel. Despite these faults, the committee noted the procedures implemented by the Navy to ensure the safety of the mission and the crew in situations which are inherently risky. Washington-based control, review, and coordination of this program has been an evolutionary matter over the years. At present, it appears to be extremely well managed, with the exception of the risk assessment area and the failure to forward the results of low-level investigations for Washington-based review. In reviewing past investigations and formal reviews, the committee noted the Navy's implementation of previous suggestions for change. There is, however, one unfortunate exception. A previous review of this program suggested that the Department of the Navy make a firm commitment to the necessity of maintaining an intelligence capability with U.S. submarines by allocating funds to research and development efforts designed to increase both the capabilities and the security of their missions. The Navy has paid only lip service to this commitment. Given these factors, the committee urges a thorough review of the program's product and hazards to avert another Pueblo, or worse, and to ensure that important intelligence collection continues with significantly less risk than presently exists. B. Interception of international communications. The National Security Agency, NSA, systematically intercepts international communications, both voice and cable. NSA officials and the Director of Central Intelligence concede that messages to and from American citizens and businesses have been picked up in the course of gathering foreign communications intelligence. They maintain, however, that these messages are small in number and usually discarded in any case. Earlier NSA programs of questionable legality focused on international narcotics traffic and radicalism, and even targeted Americans. The committee's preliminary investigation reveals at least one new area of non-political and non-military emphasis in international intercept: economic intelligence. Communications interception in this area has rapidly developed since 1972, partly in reaction to the Arab oil embargo and the failure to obtain good information on Russian grain production and negotiations for the purchase with American corporations. The committee is not convinced that the current commercial intercept program has yielded sufficiently valuable data to justify its high cost and intrusion, however inadvertent, into the privacy of international communications of U.S. citizens and organizations. Inasmuch as the technical complexity of the program defies easy or quick evaluation, the committee is hopeful that a permanent oversight mechanism will closely and comprehensively scrutinize the operation to determine whether the risks are necessary and acceptable. C. Manipulation of the media. The free flow of information, vital to a responsible and credible press, has been threatened as a result of CIA's use of the world media for cover and for clandestine information gathering. There are disturbing indications that the accuracy of many news stories has been undermined as well. Information supplied to the committee suggests that some planted, falsified articles have reached readers in the U.S. Intelligence agencies have long prized journalists as informants and identity covers. Newsmen generally enjoy great mobility and are often admitted to areas denied to ordinary businessmen or to suspected intelligence types. Not expected to work in one fixed location, both bona fide journalists and masquerading intelligence officers can move about without arousing suspicions. They also have extraordinary access to important foreign leaders and diplomats. CIA, as no doubt every other major intelligence agency in the world, has manipulated the media. Full-time foreign correspondents for major U.S. publications have worked concurrently for CIA, passing along information received in the normal course of their regular jobs, and even, on occasion, traveling to otherwise non-newsworthy areas to acquire data. Far more prevalent is the agency's practice of retaining freelancers and stringers as informants. A stringer working in a less newsworthy country could supply stories to a newspaper, radio, and a weekly magazine, none of whom can justify a full-time correspondent. This may make the use of stringers even more insidious than exploitation of full-time journalists. The committee has learned that the employment of newsmen by CIA is usually without the knowledge or agreement of the employers back in the U.S. Publishers have been unable, despite strenuous effort, to learn from the agency which, if any, of their employees have had a clandestine intelligence function. Newsmen informants apparently do not often disclose this relationship to their editors. The committee has learned of cases in which informants moved from one bona fide press position to another without ever making employers aware of their past or present CIA status. CIA acknowledges that stringers and others with whom the agency has a relationship are often directed to insert agency-composed news articles into foreign publications and wire services. U.S. intelligence officials do not rule out the possibility that these planted stories may find their way into American newspapers from time to time, but insist that CIA does not intentionally propagandize in this country. CIA insensitivity to the possibility of its adulterating news digested by Americans is indicated by its frequent manipulation of Reuters wire service dispatches, which regularly appear in U.S. media. Because Reuters is British, it is considered fair game. A number of CIA officers employed by U.S. and foreign publications write nothing at all. Their journalistic affiliation is a cover, a sham arrangement making possible full-time clandestine work for the agency. With these arrangements, the employer's cooperation has been obtained. After the Washington Star-News discovered a CIA media relationship in 1973, Director Colby ordered a review of these practices. Subsequently, the agency terminated the informant relationships of 5 full-time employees of American periodicals. Stringers and freelancers are still on the payroll, despite their periodic reporting for a U.S. media usually unaware of the writer's CIA connection. The use of American press enterprises as a cover has been tightened somewhat. No longer, for example, can a CIA officer in the field arrange for cover without headquarters approval. Director Colby, citing the agency's continuing need for reliable information and the increasing reluctance of private firms and the government to provide cover, has maintained that the recent reforms have reduced risk to an acceptable level. D. CIA presence in the executive branch. CIA personnel may be found in a host of U.S. departments and agencies, in the National Security Council, and in the White House itself. Typically, their agency affiliations are unknown to colleagues and to all others except 1 or 2 leadership figures. They sit on interagency panels whose members are unwitting. In some cases, these panels already include another official CIA representative, giving CIA undue representation. Some of them work in positions involving evaluation of CIA's work product and proposals. These individuals are detailees, CIA employees on loan to the executive, usually at the latter's request. They include all types, from gardeners and typists to intelligence analysts and practitioners of covert action. Detailees are requested for a variety of reasons, because the White House wants to circumvent congressional budget ceilings, because there are no other available secretaries with security clearances, because CIA professional expertise is highly regarded, or because the position had always been staffed by an agency officer. The committee has found no indications that CIA detailees are instructed to make clandestine reports to headquarters on the inner workings of the host employer. Nor is there credible evidence that they are asked by CIA to perform in any manner which is inconsistent with the best interests of the host. Nonetheless, the committee believes that detailing, as presently practiced, reflects an unwise policy. At best, intelligence personnel such as clerical help are diverted from CIA duties, thus frustrating the budget allocating intent of Congress. A far worse specter is that of CIA officers assigned to such posts as the National Security Council, where they are susceptible, despite all good intentions, to substantial conflicts of interest on the most sensitive issues. The latter problem is compounded by the fact that the detailee's background often is unknown to NSC colleagues who are also charged with CIA-related responsibilities. The committee discovered detailees whose agency ties were closely held secrets, making recommendations on CIA covert action proposals to unwitting senior NSC officials. Such individuals also help conduct the NSC's evaluation of the intelligence product, and in that capacity regularly compare CIA's performance with that of rival agencies. These individuals have impressed staff as highly motivated professionals, acutely aware of the problems resulting from divided loyalties. Their integrity is not at issue, but neither the White House nor the CIA is well served by an unnecessary policy which invites cynicism and compromises the quality of executive branch oversight of the intelligence community. E. CIA relationships with U.S. and foreign police. In creating the CIA, Congress clearly intended to deny it any domestic police functions. Their fear that a super-secret, bureaucratically powerful spy agency might evolve into a domestic secret police has not been realized, despite shortcomings in control and oversight. Evidence in committee files, however, indicates that during the late 1960s and early 1970s, CIA allowed itself to become involved in domestic police activity. In addition, the agency undertook other police assistance activities which jeopardized the integrity of an otherwise legitimate and useful U.S. foreign aid program. Association and collaboration with U.S. police. Notwithstanding its charter's clear prohibition against internal security functions, CIA has maintained relationships, many entirely appropriate, with various federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. Questionable activities prior to the Holtzman Amendment to the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Acts of 1968 included the training by CIA of domestic police and loans of agency equipment for domestic use. In return, local police departments cooperated with CIA on matters of concern to the agency's Office of Security. Both activities appear to have been improper. The first violated the Charter's ban on domestic police functions, and the latter tended to circumvent jurisdiction of the FBI and the Department of Justice. Of these activities, CIA's role as a source of ordinary as well as exotic equipment is perhaps the most troubling and publicized. The agency has loaned such traditional gear as body protectors, billy clubs, mace, and similar civil disturbance paraphernalia. Most of the equipment was provided during the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement and may have been used by local police during the May 1971 demonstrations in Washington. More exotic loans consisted of decoders, clandestine transmitters, analyzers, and other wiretapping devices. A staff examination of these practices reveals that CIA officials usually provided equipment on a no-questions-asked basis, did not require the production of court orders for eavesdropping gear, and exercised virtually no control over the loaned items. The record suggests that on one occasion, CIA loaned equipment was used in an illegal wiretap. In June 1971, Mr. Kenyon F. Ballou was severely wounded during a raid on his apartment by agents of the Division of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, supported by police from Montgomery and Prince George's counties in Maryland. The raid was conducted pursuant to a federal search warrant for possession of suspected firearms and hand grenades. Plainclothes agents and police officers broke down the door to the apartment when Mr. Ballou failed to answer their knock. Mr. Ballou, a gun collector, picked up a pistol, was shot, and is now permanently disabled. He is partially paralyzed, walks only with the aid of a brace and cane, speaks with difficulty, and still has the police bullet lodged in his brain. Mr. Ballou was never prosecuted for any gun control violations. The case received a large amount of publicity and was the subject of a number of investigations of alleged police misconduct. Mr. Ballou brought suit pursuant to the Federal Torts Claims Act and received an adverse judgment from the courts in February 1975. A CIA Office of Security employee assigned to liaison with the Montgomery County Police Department told staff that, in a conversation with a police inspector on the Ballou case, the possible use of CIA-loaned bugging equipment was revealed. He was advised that police intercepted a telephone conversation in which plans were outlined to, quote, kill a cop, end quote. However, neither the affidavit in support of the search warrant, the subsequent investigations, nor the transcript of the civil suit reflected the existence of any wiretap. Mr. Ballou's case is now on appeal, and if there had been an illegal wiretap, he may be entitled to a new trial. While the Department of Justice's CIA task force has been made aware of this possible wiretap for months, it has apparently refused both to act upon it and to notify the attorneys in the case. CIA involvement with foreign police. From the early 1950s until late 1973, CIA operated a proprietary International Police Services, IPS, in the Washington, D.C. area. It had the dual purpose of improving allies' internal security and evaluating foreign cadets for pro-U.S. orientation, which might later enable CIA to recruit them as intelligence assets. In the early 1960s, the Agency for International Development's Office of Public Safety, AID-OPS, became actively involved in foreign police training. OPS's 14-week course was augmented by an additional 4 weeks of training at IPS, pursuant to a contractual arrangement with AID. Students were not made aware that they were being trained at a CIA facility, and only a handful of AID officials, including the director of OPS, knew of IPS's CIA status. Instructors were asked to record names of students who demonstrated a pro-American attitude. It does not appear, however, that the CIA attempted to recruit students while in the United States, although CIA documents indicate that with the cooperation of OPS, lists of OPS and IPS students were made available, along with biographical information, to CIA components for operational use. As many as 5,000 foreign police officers from over 100 countries, many of whom have become high officials, unwittingly received training from the CIA. The positions of these foreign police officers may have been damaged when, in 1973, IPS was revealed as a CIA front. In addition to damaging the credibility of these foreign police officers, CIA's apparently unnecessary involvement with a legitimate foreign aid program could have seriously undermined that program from a propaganda standpoint. Despite these realities, AID-OPS continued its relationship with IPS until late 1973. Department of State and AID officials should review these practices and develop alternative methods of administering foreign aid programs without CIA involvement and support. 3. Domestic intelligence investigations. Domestic intelligence carries with it two distinct types of risks. There are programs that, by their very nature and methods, offend individual liberties and statutory rights. Then there are legitimate intelligence methods that are improperly applied, turning the law enforcers into lawbreakers. A. Programs as abuses. COINTELPRO was a series of covert counterintelligence programs aimed at identifying, penetrating, and neutralizing subversive elements in the United States. The program itself consisted of myriad clandestine dirty tricks carried out by FBI agents against persons and organizations considered subversive by the FBI. Careers were ruined, friendships severed, reputations sullied, businesses bankrupted, and, in some cases, lives endangered. The FBI justified this aberration from traditional law enforcement programs by stating that it was dictated by the mood of the times. The FBI, as implementers of the program, thereby became the barometer of the country's mood instead of fulfilling their statutory function of enforcing federal laws. Evidence received by the committee of FBI racism, bias, and strong conservative ideology hardly qualifies it to review people's politics. Moreover, the Constitution prohibits such a role and protects the very things FBI was attempting to punish. COINTELPRO is only one example. Another would be programs grouped under anticipatory intelligence. FBI states, quote, "Because the FBI's investigative responsibilities follow the contours of those entrusted to the Attorney General, the Bureau's domestic intelligence investigations are, of necessity, broader than investigations strictly designed to collect evidence for criminal proceedings. The FBI's domestic intelligence responsibilities have a distinct anticipatory or preventive purpose, requiring continuing investigative activity in cases wherein criminal conduct remains a future possibility. Whereas the evidence required to initiate an investigation under such a standard would obviously be something less than probable cause of a crime, it would nevertheless be more than mere suspicion. The FBI itself states that advocacy of an ideology alone is not sufficient grounds for classifying a group as subversive. Anticipatory domestic intelligence projects, however, do create serious problems on occasion. A few examples illustrate the point. Lori Patton testified before the committee on November 18, 1975. In 1974, Ms. Patton, then a high school student, inadvertently wrote the Social Workers' Party as an academic assignment. She intended to write to the Socialist Labor Party. The FBI was conducting a mail cover on the SWP and intercepted Ms. Patton's misdirected letter. They immediately began an investigation of her, and the attendant publicity in Ms. Patton's small town caused her great mental anguish. The Bureau's response was that the, quote, FBI did not publicize the fact, end quote, of Lori Patton's investigation, although they had interviewed her school principal and the local police chief. Assume, however, that Ms. Patton had correctly written to the SWP, as many people undoubtedly have. That fact alone would apparently have been grounds for an anticipatory investigation, even though it is hard to imagine what crimes could be anticipated by writing a letter. In addition, the chilling effect such investigations have on First Amendment rights, including freedom of association, is painfully clear. For those who do join SWP, the chill is likely to spread to employers. The committee heard from one witness who termed FBI's inquiries about his employee, Bruce Bloy, who was an SWP member, as, quote, presumptive, mysterious, and aggressive, end quote. Trash covers are another odious form of anticipatory investigations. The IPS trash cover has already been discussed, save for a comment on command and control. When FBI personnel were originally asked about trash covers by committee staff, they stated, quote, we have not engaged in trash covers since July 1966. We had no trash covers on the IPS, end quote. 2 weeks later, at a committee hearing, they corrected themselves. They stated that while there was an FBI policy of not conducting trash covers, that policy was not always followed. 2 memoranda show that the Bureau knew of the trash covers and recognized the risks in such a method. The concerns? The, quote, potential harm to the FBI and the federal government, per se, far outweigh the potential information that could be expected, end quote. It was not risks to an individual's right of privacy that concerned the FBI. B. Law enforcement turned law-breaking. The use of informants, albeit an effective law enforcement tool, is a method of investigation which is particularly subject to abuses of constitutional rights and rights of privacy. The committee heard testimony from a former FBI informant named Robert Hardy. Mr. Hardy chronicled for the committee his role in a 1971 Camden Draft Board break-in. Pursuant to FBI instructions, he infiltrated a peaceful anti-war group in Camden, New Jersey. He instigated the burglary and supplied the would-be burglars with tools, money, technical assistance, and encouragement. In sum, Mr. Hardy acted as an agent provocateur. At one point, he attempted to halt the actual burglary because a conspiracy had been established. His FBI handling agents insisted that the burglary be committed. The disturbing lesson is that in the FBI system, there is virtually no mechanism to control agents in charge of informants. The FBI Manual of Instructions on Informants sets forth specific guidelines for the handling of informants, yet the uniqueness and secrecy surrounding each informant's relationship with the handling agent impairs the effectiveness of those instructions. In the Hardy case, the informant-agent relationship was further complicated by political considerations. The defendants, in a celebrated case in nearby Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, had recently been acquitted of all conspiracy counts. The FBI apparently felt that an overt act such as an actual break-in would be required to ensure a conviction, even though the alleged crime of conspiracy, which was the basis of later prosecution, appears to have been completed far in advance of the actual break-in. It should be noted that Department of Justice attorneys were advised of this situation long before the break-in and did nothing to avert the course of events. The committee investigated another example of lack of control over informants. The FBI used Robert Merritt as an informant on New Left activities during the early 1970s. His duties included reporting on activities at the Institute of Policy Studies. Merritt told the committee that his FBI handling agents instructed him to conduct break-ins, deliver unopened mail acquired illegally, and solicit and provide information to the FBI regarding homosexual proclivities of politically prominent people and individuals of the New Left. The FBI agents who handled Merritt denied these allegations under oath. They stated that Merritt acted on his own. The handling agents stated that they terminated Merritt because they ascertained that he had provided false information on one occasion and had reason to believe he provided false information at other times in the past. If this was true, it does not fit with other facts. During the 7 months that Merritt was an FBI informant, he provided over 100 reports on at least 25 people. He had, in fact, been categorized as reliable in FBI records. No effort was ever made to correct the Merritt reports by indicating that the information contained therein might be unreliable. No prosecutive actions were ever recommended as a result of Merritt's allegedly wrong actions. His efforts apparently fit well with intelligence operations. Furthermore, Merritt told staff that he had committed numerous illegal acts at the direction of District of Columbus Metropolitan Police. His FBI handling agents stated that although they acquired Merritt from the Metropolitan Police Department, they never inquired as to the nature of his prior activities as a police informant. This attitude of see no evil, hear no evil appears to violate the seemingly rigid regulations of the FBI manual designed to effect the recruitment of responsible and reliable informants. Conflicting testimony in the Merritt matter reveals the problem itself. Since FBI agents' instructions to their informants are, by necessity, given orally and without witnesses, it is difficult, if not impossible, to accurately fix responsibility for an informant's actions. If the FBI agent is at fault, the problem becomes one of administrative command and control. If, however, the informant has gone bad, the problem is more difficult. For example, if an informant successfully instigates others to commit a crime, as in the Hardy matter, his FBI contact agent may overlook the informant's improper actions because the informant is important to a case for which the FBI agent is likely to receive credit. The risk that informants may use illegal methods is heightened when one considers the kind of person needed to infiltrate suspected criminal elements. Understanding the problem, James Adams, assistant to the director of FBI, testified before the committee on November 18, 1975. Quote, "The informants you develop are not recruited from Sunday schools." End quote. The dubious character of most informants is compounded by the fact that informants are paid cash and their payment is commensurate with the information they furnish. The more incriminating the information, the more lucrative the reward. Electronic surveillance. The Kissinger wiretaps. In the last half-century, electronic technology has revolutionized the science of investigations. These developments also mean that Big Brother may be watching. Improper application of electronic surveillance poses obvious risks because of its enormous potential for invading privacy and the difficulty of detecting intrusion. Some examples follow. In the spring of 1969, the Nixon White House was disturbed that extremely sensitive information regarding diplomatic relations and national security was leaking to the press on a fairly regular basis. On May 9, 1969, William Beecher of the New York Times wrote an article on Cambodia which triggered a strong reaction from the White House. That day, a series of telephone calls to ascertain the source of the leaks took place. The calls were between Dr. Kissinger and J. Edgar Hoover, and between Colonel Alexander Haig and FBI personnel. The apparent result of these consultations was the installation of a wiretap on the residence of a National Security Council staff on May 9, 1969. Significantly, approval for this national security wiretap was not requested until May 10, 1969. The wiretap was requested by Colonel Haig, quote, on the highest authority, end quote, and was not approved by Attorney General John Mitchell until May 12, 1969. 17 persons were eventually wiretapped pursuant to this program. Although the FBI never overheard information indicating any breach of national security, the taps continued for lengthy periods of time. No approval was ever sought for extensions of the wiretaps, as they continued unabated and unsupervised. In addition, the FBI continued to report information which can only be characterized as political or personal. William C. Sullivan, former Chief of Intelligence for the FBI, told staff that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover did not regard these tapes as FBI operations, but as executive requests. According to Mr. Sullivan, Hoover insisted on sending copies of the transcripts directly to the White House, so the president would be apprised of the service FBI was providing. Several risks were inherent in the FBI's national security wiretaps installed for Dr. Kissinger. The first involved wiretapping United States citizens without prior judicial approval. These dangers were recognized by the Supreme Court in 1972. The court held that electronic surveillance of domestic organizations or citizens was forbidden unless prior judicial approval was obtained. Secondly, wiretapping State Department officials and members of the press tends to stifle voices of criticism and dissenting views and infringes upon freedom of the press. Finally, the Kissinger wiretaps posed a risk that the FBI could become the tool by which an administration in power obtains political information. The Houston episode. On October 9, 1975, Anthony Zavala, a former narcotics officer with the Houston Police Department who had been sentenced to 3 years imprisonment on wiretap convictions, told the committee of widespread illegal police wiretapping in Houston, Texas from 1969 through 1972. Mr. Zavala recounted that wiretapping had become, quote, second nature to us all, end quote, and, quote, that it was all discussed freely and that everyone knew what was going on, end quote. In 1973, Anthony J.P. Ferris, United States Attorney for the Southern District of Texas, learned of allegations of wiretapping. He brought this information to the attention of the FBI in the fall of 1973 and requested that the Bureau investigate. They did not. His requests continued. Finally, in April 1974, the FBI assigned one special agent to investigate the case. He filed reports which, according to Ferris, were, quote, notable only in their lack of substance, consisting largely of Xeroxed newspaper articles, end quote. 4. SALT. Political control of intelligence. Nowhere is the risk of corrupting intelligence greater than in recent efforts to restrict and shape important data on Soviet compliance with strategic arms agreements. Staff investigation and examination of key documents reveal that these SALT treaties, which are of grave strategic significance, were consummated without full intelligence input, that the prime U.S. official who sponsored the accords also effectively controls the verification of their feasibility, and that day-to-day intelligence analysis of compliance is hindered by arbitrary and inconsistent attempts to prevent leaks of SALT data. The prime factor in this situation is Dr. Kissinger, with his passion for secrecy and his efforts to concentrate power and to consolidate ultimate control of important intelligence functions through his various bureaucratic roles. It is clear that in the final stages of the SALT talks, U.S. negotiators did not fully consult or inform intelligence experts who had been key figures in previous treaty sessions. Only Russian technical experts were on hand. Dr. Kissinger's private talks with Soviet leaders in this period were not disseminated. Some officials assert that ambiguities, which plague the accords, may have been the result of U.S. policymakers' self-imposed intelligence blackout at the critical moment. The record indicates that Dr. Kissinger, U.S. architect of the accords, has attempted to control the dissemination and analysis of data on apparent Soviet violations of the SALT Pact. Although CIA, as the government's principal analytical arm, has both general and specific responsibility for the monitoring of SALT compliance, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs has advised the agency to avoid any written judgment that the Soviets are in violation of SALT agreements. Such findings were to be privately communicated to the National Security Council, which, coincidentally, was headed by Dr. Kissinger. When sensitive intelligence reports on Soviet compliance began to turn up with regularity, the National Security Council initiated the procedure of severely restricting dissemination of the information by causing it to be placed in a hold status. Typically, the CIA Deputy Director for Intelligence would, in consultation with NSC staff, place an item on hold until Dr. Kissinger or his representative agreed to release it. Two principal reasons have been given for access restriction: fear of leaks by officials seeking to influence U.S. SALT policy, and the need for adequate time to determine a report's real significance, thus avoiding rash judgments on complicated technical issues. This unusual procedure, invoked previously in such momentous situations as the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, has been strangely implemented this time. At times, the Secretary of State, the Director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and key U.S. officials in SALT compliance meetings with the Soviets have not been aware of the existence of sensitive data suggesting Soviet cheating. Dissemination within several intelligence components has been haphazard and uncontrolled. Two other problems with the hold process detract from the integrity of the intelligence product. NSC staff, for example, has influenced the timing and content of intelligence community publications. Worse, both high officials and working-level analysts have been cut off from information for periods of time ranging from days to 6 months. Dr. Kissinger's comments on this situation are at variance with the facts. The specter of important information suggesting Soviet violation of strategic arms limitations purposefully withheld for extended periods of time from analysts, decision-makers, and members of Congress has caused great controversy within the intelligence community. In addition, it has raised questions as to the President's own knowledge of and concurrence with the hold procedure. The problem continues as official fears of leaks and policymakers' penchant for a unified view on SALT goes on. Former State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research Director Ray S. Klein, in testimony before the committee, framed the issue. Quote, "I do think the Congress should be sure that the procedures for handling of strategic intelligence should have certain checks and balances in them so that there is no possibility of suppression of information that is unattractive to policymakers." End quote. Klein concluded, quote, "As I was leaving government, I found these procedures breaking down, and that is why I feel that the problem does deserve attention from the Congress." End quote. This is Our Hidden History